In every room, in every circle of influence, people try to project strength. They put on confidence, they wear charm, they speak loudly. But underneath the mask, subtle cracks appear, not in what they say, but in how they behave when nobody agrees with them. Machiavelli lived in a world where trust could cost a kingdom. He couldn't afford to be deceived by appearances. Surrounded by flatterers, cowards, and schemers, he had to distinguish between those who carried real power and those who only pretended. For him, weakness was more dangerous than open hostility, because the weak man, desperate to be accepted, would betray faster than an enemy. That's why Machiavelli became a master of reading hidden behaviors. He studied people with the same focus a predator studies prey, and he noticed repeating patterns, psychological signatures that exposed fragile men instantly. These patterns weren't loud or obvious. They were subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer. But once you trained your eye, you could see them everywhere. And when you recognized them, you gained an invisible weapon: discernment. The ability to see not who someone pretends to be, but who they truly are. In this breakdown, we'll explore the three main behaviors that reveal weakness. We'll uncover how Machiavelli used them to his advantage. And finally, we'll see how he applied the same principles to himself, ensuring he never fell victim to his own vulnerabilities. This isn't just about judging others. It's about sharpening your vision, refining your presence, and removing weakness from within. Because the man who cannot master himself cannot lead others. Let's begin with the first behavior. One so common, you'll start spotting it everywhere once you understand it. The first subtle behavior is overjustification. Weak men explain, strong men decide. That's the difference. When someone constantly explains themselves, defends their actions, or repeats their reasoning, it's not clarity. It's insecurity disguised as explanation. Machiavelli noticed this constantly in courts and councils. A confident ruler spoke with few words. His authority needed no defense. But the minister, the courtier, the merchant, those who were desperate to be respected, never stopped talking. They wanted others to agree with their logic. But the truth was, they were begging for validation. Overjustification is not persuasion. It is a plea for permission. And the man who begs for permission to exist cannot hold power, because power demands conviction. It demands the ability to move without apology. The insecure man repeats his opinions endlessly, hoping to sound reasonable, moral, or kind. But each repetition reveals collapse, not confidence. Overjustification always points back to fear. Fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of carrying authority without others' approval. And Machiavelli understood something critical. The man who must be liked cannot be trusted with real power. Power requires silence. Power requires decision without hesitation. Power requires words that stand without needing support. So the next time you hear someone explaining, defending, or repeating themselves too much, don't mistake it for clarity. It's the sound of weakness leaking out. It's the sound of a man who cannot stand alone. And Machiavelli, with his sharp eye, used this behavior as a test. He could separate the men who ruled from the men who pleaded. The difference was never in the words. It was always in the conviction, or lack of it. The overjustifier showed his fragility the moment he opened his mouth. And Machiavelli never forgot that. The second behavior Machiavelli spotted was far more deceptive. On the surface, it looked like kindness, but underneath, it was weakness in disguise. He called it weaponized niceness. At first glance, these men seemed agreeable, helpful, friendly. They smiled often. They avoided conflict. They offered compliments freely. But their so-called kindness wasn't born from strength. It came from fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of tension. Fear of standing alone. A strong man can choose kindness. But when he does, it is selective, intentional, and never at the cost of his dignity. He can say no without apology. He can refuse without guilt. His kindness comes from control, not from desperation. But the weak man is different. His friendliness is constant. He agrees with everyone. He apologizes even when he is not wrong. He laughs at jokes that insult him. He stays quiet when he should speak up, because his goal is not truth or principle. His goal is approval. He believes if he is endlessly pleasant, no one will reject him. But here's the trap. When his strategy fails, when his niceness doesn't buy him validation, he flips. He becomes bitter, sarcastic, resentful. His smile cracks and reveals the anger underneath. Because his friendliness was never authentic. It was submission dressed up as virtue. Machiavelli studied this pattern in rulers, ministers, and ordinary men. And he concluded one rule. A man whose identity depends on being agreeable cannot be trusted. Why? Because his loyalty is not built on conviction. It is built on fear. And when fear is tested, loyalty evaporates. This is why Machiavelli saw compulsive niceness as one of the coldest signs of weakness. He understood that a man who says yes to everything cannot be relied upon when saying no matters most. He understood that the people pleaser collapses under pressure because his entire sense of worth depends on being liked. And when liking fails, betrayal follows. For Machiavelli, kindness was not weakness. But fear disguised as kindness always was. The weak man bows too quickly. He avoids tension at all costs. He surrenders his own dignity to maintain harmony. But in doing so, he loses the very respect he craves. Weaponized niceness is not generosity. It is cowardice wrapped in politeness, and once Machiavelli saw it, he knew exactly how fragile the man before him truly was. The third behavior Machiavelli recognized was the loudest of all. He called it display addiction. You've seen this type of man before. He cannot sit in silence. He cannot move in private. He always needs to be seen, heard, praised. He posts constantly. He exaggerates victories. He makes small achievements sound like great conquests. He turns every room into a stage. At first, he might appear confident. But Machiavelli understood the truth. This man is not confident. He is terrified. Terrified of being forgotten. Terrified of being unseen. Terrified of being irrelevant. Because to him, attention is life, and silence is death. The man addicted to display doesn't build foundations inside himself. He builds mirrors outside himself, hoping others will reflect his worth back at him. But when the applause stops, when the spotlight dims, he collapses. Because his value only exists in the eyes of others. Machiavelli saw this pattern everywhere in politics. He knew that the man who cannot live without attention will do anything to get it. Lie, exaggerate, betray. Expose secrets if it earns recognition. Start conflicts just to be noticed. This is why display addicts are so dangerous to keep close. They are unpredictable, desperate, and easily controlled. Because if you want to ruin them, you don't even need to attack. You only need to ignore them. Take away the applause. Cut off the recognition. Watch them unravel in desperation. Machiavelli knew this made them unreliable allies, because a man who cannot survive silence cannot be trusted with power. The strong man grows in private. He trains in the dark. He sharpens his skills without witnesses. He builds silently, then strikes without warning. But the weak man addicted to display cannot wait. He must always be visible, even at the cost of his own stability. And that visibility makes him both predictable and easy to manipulate. Machiavelli classified such men as liabilities, not because they lacked ambition, but because their ambition was hollow. It was driven by fear, not by strength. And fear always collapses under pressure. For him, the man addicted to display was never a leader. He was a puppet waiting for strings. And Machiavelli, being the strategist, knew exactly how to pull them. Machiavelli didn't stop at simply identifying weakness. He used it. Where most men grew frustrated with liars, flatterers, and insecure allies, he saw tools. To him, weakness wasn't just a flaw. It was leverage. It was something to be shaped and directed. Because when you know what a man fears, you don't need to fight him. You can guide him without resistance. The over-justifier, the people-pleaser, the attention addict, each revealed his own strings. And once those strings were visible, pulling them required almost no effort. This was Machiavelli's genius. He didn't rely on strength alone. He didn't force obedience through threats or cruelty. He made people obey themselves. All he needed to do was feed their insecurities in small, calculated doses. The over-justifier wanted validation, so Machiavelli gave it to him. He would listen quietly, nod in agreement, and say, "That makes perfect sense." The justifier, craving that rare approval, would immediately attach himself. He would become loyal, protective, even defensive of Machiavelli, believing he had found someone who truly understood him. But it wasn't understanding. It was control. The people-pleaser wanted to feel safe, included, chosen. So Machiavelli would assign him tasks, make him feel important, give him a sense of belonging. That man would never betray him, not because of true loyalty, but because losing that approval meant losing his fragile identity. The display addict wanted the spotlight, so Machiavelli gave it. He let him take credit in public. He let him speak at meetings, bask in praise, and wear the costume of influence. But behind the curtain, Machiavelli wrote the script. He knew that as long as the addict believed he was seen, he would never question who truly held power. This was Machiavelli's silent empire, built not through war, but through psychology, through understanding the desperate needs of weak men, and then shaping those needs into loyalty, compliance, and predictable behavior. He realized something timeless. The weak man doesn't need chains. He builds his own cage. All Machiavelli had to do was hand him the key and watch him lock himself in. That was the art of weaponizing weakness, not with brute force, but with subtle direction. To fully grasp Machiavelli's strategy, you need to understand one principle. Weak men don't want freedom. They want approval. They want the emotional sugar that keeps their fragile sense of self alive. And that makes them incredibly easy to control. Machiavelli saw this clearly. He didn't waste energy demanding obedience. He made weak men believe obedience was their own choice. He became the rare source of what they craved most: validation, inclusion, recognition. And because it was rare, they valued it like gold. Here's how he did it. First, he mastered silence. Weak men talk endlessly. They explain, they defend, they overexpose themselves. But Machiavelli stayed quiet. He let them reveal their flaws. And when he finally spoke, it felt heavy, valuable, unforgettable. One compliment from him carried more weight than 100 from others. Why? Because rarity creates value. Second, he became the calm in their chaos. Weak men panic when criticized. They spiral when ignored. They collapse when plans shift. But Machiavelli never mirrored that instability. He moved slowly, with intention, always composed. This contrast made him seem unshakable, and in their eyes, that stability looked like strength. They projected power onto him because he was the opposite of their own reactivity. Third, he used unpredictability. He didn't reward consistently. Sometimes he praised, sometimes he ignored, sometimes he vanished. This uncertainty created obsession. Weak men couldn't stop thinking about him. They kept performing, hoping for the next drop of approval. They talked about him, defended him, worked harder to stay close. And all the while, Machiavelli barely lifted a finger. This is the essence of psychological power. You don't chain people. You make them chain themselves. You don't demand loyalty. You make them hunger for it. By controlling their emotional supply, you become the silent architect of their behavior. And because they never see it as manipulation, they call it respect, admiration, even love. That's why Machiavelli didn't just defeat weak men. He used them. He turned their insecurities into fuel for his rise. And he did it all without ever needing to shout. Because real control is invisible, it feels voluntary, it feels chosen, and that illusion is stronger than any command. Machiavelli's brilliance wasn't only in reading others, he also turned his vision inward, because he understood a dangerous truth. The same weaknesses he despised in others could appear in himself. And if he didn't hunt them daily, they would betray him before his enemies ever could. Weakness doesn't knock on the door. It slips in quietly, through the need to explain, through the habit of apologizing for no reason, through the craving for approval, through the urge to be seen. It whispers instead of shouts. And if you don't catch it, it grows. Machiavelli created a system to detect it. First, he watched how often he explained himself. When you are strong, you make decisions. When you are weak, you explain them endlessly. So he trained himself to stop, to notice when words were driven by insecurity rather than conviction, and to cut them off before they escaped his mouth. Second, he measured his agreements. Yes is a dangerous word when it comes from fear. Agreeing to avoid conflict, agreeing to stay liked, agreeing without boundaries. Each yes made him weaker. So he paused before agreeing to anything and asked himself, would I say yes if I had no fear of rejection? If the answer was no, he declined, without apology, because he knew one weak yes could ruin a kingdom. Third, he trained in silence. Weak men panic in silence. They fill it with chatter, compliments, or nervous laughter. But Machiavelli made silence his weapon. He practiced sitting in it. He learned to lean into it when it felt uncomfortable. Because silence, when mastered, becomes presence. And presence, when mastered, becomes power. Fourth, he resisted the temptation of exposure. The weak man always wants the spotlight. The strong man chooses his moments. So Machiavelli practiced invisibility. He built in shadows, waited in patience, then struck suddenly, so that when he moved, people didn't see progress. They saw arrival. He became a storm appearing out of nowhere, not through announcements, but through absence, followed by precision. By stripping these weak behaviors from himself, he removed every crack his enemies could exploit. He didn't just play offense, he fortified his defense. Because the man who is unshakable inside cannot be broken from outside. That was Machiavelli's code. Master others, but master yourself first. At the highest level, Machiavelli understood one thing. Respect is not asked for, it is engineered. The weak man begs for respect. He tries to look strong. He talks too loudly. He smiles too often. He explains too much. And because of this, he never earns what he seeks. The strong man does the opposite. He reveals less. He speaks little. He stands firm in silence. And because people cannot figure him out, they begin to respect him. Human nature fears what it cannot explain, and Machiavelli knew how to use that fear. He trained himself to show nothing unnecessary. No pleading, no desperation, no addiction to being seen. He became the calmest man in the room, the most silent, the most disciplined. And that silence weighed more than 100 loud speeches. People began to adjust their tone around him. They measured their words. They feared looking weak in his presence, because his presence exposed what they lacked. That is the ultimate form of influence, not forcing others to listen, but making them afraid to disappoint. Not demanding loyalty, but inspiring it without effort. This is why Machiavelli believed respect should be expensive. You don't give it freely. You don't flatter casually. You don't smile for everyone. You make people earn it, because rare things always become valuable. And when your approval is rare, your presence becomes priceless. Weak men fear discomfort. They fear rejection. They fear silence. But the Machiavellian man embraces them all. He doesn't collapse under judgment. He sharpens under it. And because of that, he becomes something alien, untouchable. That is why people follow him, not because he forces them, but because they cannot resist him. He doesn't play the game of weak men. He rises above it. Until one day, while they chase applause, he stands silent and everyone realizes the real crown was his all along. You've now seen how Machiavelli read weakness, how he spotted it in others, how he weaponized it for power, and how he killed it within himself. The overjustifier, the compulsive people-pleaser, the addict of display. 3 masks of weakness, 3 behaviors that betray fragility every single time. Machiavelli turned them into leverage. He built loyalty from insecurity. He built influence from fear. And he built respect from silence. That is the Machiavellian blueprint, not brute strength, but psychological engineering. Not loud demands, but quiet mastery. If you found these insights valuable, make sure to like this video. Subscribe to Psychology Insights for more deep explorations into power, influence, and human behavior. And remember, weakness doesn't reveal itself in words. It reveals itself in patterns. Spot the cracks, sharpen your silence, and rise in ways they will never understand.